If you can't see them in particular, you're not going to get lost. You'll hear from me. But we're going to cover, over the next couple minutes, we're going to cover three different reformers. One in the 15th century, the 1400s, and then two in the 1500s, the 16th century. And we're going to cover a little bit about the area, because they all come from kind of one area that I'm going to be talking about. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how some of that led to the RCA today. I also have a number of books up here, some that I've used in putting the presentation together. For those who might be interested, especially, I was hoping some of we've had a lot of newcomers lately, which is really great. I was hoping some of them might stick around. But if you're interested, Our Reformed Church, this is a little pamphlet. It helps direct a little bit about some of the confessions of our faith. You're welcome to take one of these red ones. These are for taking. The other books are my books that I'd be glad to get a copy of for you if you're interested. But they are talk about the Reformed Church and kind of what our tradition is. Talk about the Heidelberg Catechism, which I mentioned. Not only the questions and answers, but the scriptural basis for each of the answers, which is always important to understand. Not just that there's a series of teaching, questions and answers, but where does it come from in the Bible? This goes through the Lord's Prayer, it goes through the Apostles' Creed, all kinds of good stuff. We have a Belgic Confession. This book is written on the Belgic Confession. My friend Al Jansen wrote that book. It's a really good one. And then there's Ecumenical Creeds and Reformed Confessions. This has the creeds that we say are part of our standards, which are the Apostles, the Nicene, the Athanasian Creed. The Athanasian Creed is a commonly held one in Protestant churches, but it's really long, so you've never read it in church, I would imagine. Nicene, some Apostles for sure. It also has the Belgic Confession, the Heidelberg Catechism, and the Canons of the Synod of Dort. The last one isn't in here. We have an additional confession now that it's a South African one, and for whatever reason it's not coming to my mind, which is terrible, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. What's that? It gets worse as you age. And then these series of books. Luke said, "Dad, why are you reading comic books?" I was, over the last week or so, I have these books. They're the blank for Armchair Theologians. They have cartoons in them. I love this series of books. It's a great summary. This is the Reformation. I have Calvin, Luther, Heretics, and Liberation Theology. There's a whole series. Wesley, all these different people. You can learn a lot about people. They give you the details. They try and make it a little fun with a cartoon here or there. But they are really good information written by good scholarly authors, too, just in fun ways. So you can take a look at those. They are not available for you to take, but they can be available for you if you just let me know you want one. I'll be happy to order any of them for you. There might be. I don't know for sure the whole series, but Reformation, yeah, I don't know, but yeah, these are just that might be too. But the Armchair Theologians series is a good one. And just to note, I never put anything on the table during worship. It has the water of baptism, the cup and the plate and the candle. We're not in worship right now, so excuse me for using it as a table. It is not. We're not in worship, but that is something that I kind of don't do in worship. I never treat it as a piece of furniture. So, three profiles in RCA roots, and I'm just going to keep telling Paul to switch the slides as we go, and I'll look over my shoulder this way, actually. Go ahead, Paul. Next one. There we go. Our first is the one you might not know. My favorite one, because he's the foundation for them all, in my opinion, and this is Jan Hus, or John Hus. Usually we talk, his name is properly Jan Hus, but anglicized, we get the John. He is in Bohemia, and we talk about it during the Pre-Reformation. Reformation historically starts in the 1500s. Hus, you can see, 1369 to 1415. Next slide, Paul. So these areas are kind of where we are. So there's three red arrows. They correspond to three reformers. We have one arrow in Germany. That's Wittenberg. That's the home of Martin Luther. We have another arrow in Prague. That's the home of Jan Hus. And we have another arrow in Geneva. where John Calvin settles. So you can see that the Reformation and these Reform movements, they kind of come all from this area of Central Europe. And France has a huge Reformation too, but everybody's killed. So we don't know much about the Huguenots these days because they had a Catholic king who really wiped them out. So we don't hear about them as much. Next slide. Things to know. Jan Hus, the Bohemian Reformation we call it, starting in the 1400s. He's born to a poor family from Husiek, which means goose town. We're going to get to why that's important later. He attended the University of Prague, a very prestigious university, which was split by German and Czech leadership. One of the things we're going to learn about in the Reformation is that Germans and Italians tend to rub people the wrong way. So the Germans and Italians tend to have power. And the Reformation is as much political as it is religious in many cases, usually rebelling against Germans and Italians. So we're going to talk about that. The University of Prague was overseen by the German church. They had German chancellors and Czech chancellors. The German chancellors always had more people on the board of the university than the Czechs, so that the Germans always would win, which is political, but that's what happened. So Jan Hus is also appointed, not only did he go to the university, he's going to be appointed as the priest at Bethlehem Chapel. That's a really important chapel, opened in 1391. He takes the pulpit in 1401. This is a prominent church in Prague, home to Reform-minded folks, and at the time, the royal church of King Wenceslas from the Christmas Carol. Next slide. Bethlehem Chapel. This is pictures from when I was there in Prague. There are paintings in the chapel. These are not like Catholic stained glass windows at the time, but rather paintings that show on one side the Pope, for example, riding a horse in fine regalia, and on the very other side, Jesus washing his disciples' feet in rags. They teach through pictures, and they're subversive in their pictures. So anybody going into Bethlehem Chapel knows, this is kind of a subversive place to be. Next one.
Why wouldn't they have Christ on the donkey in front of them?
Why wouldn't they have Christ on the donkey?
Yeah.
Well, they're showing the Pope on a horse in fine regalia. They're contrasting it. Yeah, the donkey would have been good too, surely. Sorry, Paul, I keep moving out of the picture here. This is a picture of the other side of Bethlehem Chapel as it is today. Next one. People still worship there, yeah. And in Prague is not an intensely Christian area anymore, but we're going to hear about the impact that Hus made there. Here we go. Bohemian politics you need to know about. Whoops. We're almost there. I'll give you a little Bohemian politics off the top of my head. I think it'll correspond to what's going on. What you need to know about that area in the world at that time. There are not one, but two popes. In the 1300s, we have what we call the Western Schism. There are popes that align. One is in Avignon, France, and one is in Rome. And different parts of Catholicism start aligning with different popes. And the Bohemian branch of Catholicism, the German branch, was with Gregory the 13th, I want to say. It'll be confirmed in a minute here. But what happens is that as this is going on, they decide to have a council in Pisa to straighten things out. Once and for all, in 1409, they're going to elect a pope to end the rules of the other two popes, so we have one united pope. What happens is now there's three popes. Because believe it or not, the other two popes didn't want to give up their papacy. So the new German leaders, they support Gregory the 12th, Wenceslas, and the Czech leaders support the new pope. So the German leaders now are saying Gregory's the true pope. The Bohemian leaders are saying, no, it's Alexander the 6th. So now we have a break. And now the university is saying, well, we follow Gregory. And the king says, these German chancellors, they have too much power in the university. From now on, every Czech chancellor's vote counts for 3. And Germans only count for 1. So instead of 3-2, now we have 6-3. Well, the Germans leave town. So now it's Bohemian, And because the archbishop and the king both support this, then Jan Hus is appointed head of the university as a Czech now. I think my battery might have just gone out here. There we are. And he is also the priest at Bethlehem Chapel. He's preaching there. Next slide. So Hus has a reform-minded archbishop and supportive king. Therefore, he can do things that are not legal in Catholicism at the time because he's protected. One of the things he does that we know that Martin Luther invented, but really didn't, is preaching in the native language. So I think my battery's running short, Paul, so I'm going to try and get a new one as I preach here. Preach, teach, whatever. One of the things that's going on is that there's a man named John Wycliffe in England, and he says, we really need to translate the Bible into more than just Latin. We need the common people to be able to read it. So the Wycliffe Bible translators today still are a big thing in honor of Wycliffe. And Hus follows in that. There's a lot of exchange of ideas between England and Prague at the time because King Wenceslas' sister is the Queen of England. So there's a lot of academics going back and forth. They bring these ideas that we should have preaching in the common language. Hus says, yes, we should. So in Bethlehem Chapel, the only place in Bohemia you can hear a sermon in Czech and not Latin. Hus began to teach and preach that Jesus is the true head of the church, not the Pope. Therefore, church doctrine does not overrule the Bible, and therefore the Pope's word is not infallible. These are dangerous ideas in the Reformation. We're not at the Reformation yet, but Hus is promoting these. He also taught biblical literacy and taught that we should have scriptural answers to our questions, not church doctrine. Go ahead, Paul, next one. They also have an idea that at the time communion was only served by the bread. Lay people only got bread. Hus said that we should have the cup too. You get to have the cup and the bread, which was earth-shaking at the time. To us, we would say, well, yeah, we don't have a common cup because of COVID or whatever. For us, it's more of a germ thing now when we don't do it. It's not a theological thing. But to this day, followers of Hus, the churches that follow Hus, their banners have the chalice on them because that was such a revolutionary thing. He could have been excommunicated for these things, but he was protected because he had a supportive king and archbishop. But this changes in 1409. Paul, next slide, please. In 1410, Pope John the 23rd is elected because Pope Alexander, who had been elected as the third pope 1 year earlier, dies. Pope John the 23rd wants to begin a war to get the rival popes taken care of. To do this, he needs to go to his treasury of merit, and he introduces indulgences, okay? We're going to talk about indulgences in a bit, but in essence, it's fundraising for a reason. We'll get to the reason behind it. But the thing about it, Hus didn't agree with indulgences, as Luther famously will speak against them later, but the king got a cut of the indulgences raised in his kingdom, so he now breaks with Hus, because Hus is becoming an outspoken critic of the Pope, and the king's like, I was with you before, but now you're hitting my pocketbook. So now there's a disconnect between the two, and Wenceslas breaks with Hus, and Hus is excommunicated from the church at this time. Paul, next one. All the services in Prague are shut down. The Pope says the whole city, no more Mass can be said. And a papal bull says so in 1412. And Hus famously, well, actually it's Luther who's usually the famous one, but Hus 100 years before him takes the papal decree, the papal bull, and his friend Jerome and he burn it in the town square. Burning the papal bull, not something that's safe at that time, or any time really. The papal bull is a declaration by the Pope that shuts down preaching and communion in Prague, and they say the Pope does not have authority over our preaching, which kind of the Pope did have authority over his preaching. This is a revolutionary thing to happen. And Hus becomes excommunicated. He goes to retreat to the south. He begins writing widely in the Czech language theological treatises, and he standardizes modern Czech language We're going to hear 100 years later about that in German and how Luther revolutionarily does something, but Hus does it first 100 years before. Hus is brought to the Council of Constance in 1415 to defend himself. He goes under the protection offered by the king and the pope. They say, you'll have safe travel if you come. We will not kill you if you come to defend yourself. He goes. They immediately throw him into prison for 8 months. They put him on trial. And when he's put on trial, he's not allowed to have a defense. They tell him, recant what you've done or face the punishment. He says, if you can tell me where I'm wrong in the Bible, I will be glad to recant what I've said. They say, recant what you've said or face the consequences. He says, I guess I can only do what I'm doing. And they sentence him to be killed, to be burned at the stake, after offering him safe passage. Hus's last name, Hus, comes from his town, Goose Town, Husiek. Hus famously says, the goose will be cooked. This is where we get the phrase, one's goose is cooked. Jan Hus, whose last name means goose, is burned at the stake, and that's where, in 1415, that's where we get the phrase. Next slide, Paul.
And are there still two popes at this time?
No, in 1415, they depose all the popes and elect a new one.
It's in Rome.
Yes. So actually what happens, Chris, in this, the pope who's struggling for power out of the three figures if they really nail Hus, all the other stuff will go away. So he's in charge of killing Hus, and then they depose him and elect a new pope. So his kind of machinations to try and be the one pope doesn't really work, but in the meantime, Hus is taken out. There's a rebellion in Bohemia that follows because people have become Hussites. Wenceslas tries to put it down, and I don't know, does anybody know what defenestration, what that word means, Peter?
Throw them out the window.
Throwing one person or thing out the window. It's an interesting English word that a lot of kids in their teens learn and say, defenestration. I'm going to practice that, throwing something out of the window. It comes from Prague, where there are many defenestrations over the years. Their town hall is located on the second floor. I've been there. When they don't like what's going on, historically, they throw people out the window. So the first defenestration, it's the first, it tells you that there's more than one, happens in 1419 when King Wenceslas's guys are found at town hall and Hussites' followers throw them out the window and kill them. So in 1419, the first defenestration of Prague, the Hussites control Bohemia until 1620. So we think Luther ushers in the Reformation. We're talking about a group that broke off the Catholic Church in 1415 and stayed independent and powerfully, so much so that the Pope could not overtake that place until 1620. Modern day movements. Hussites become Czech Brethren, become the Church of the Brethren. So there's an American expression of Jan Hus still today. And the Czech Brethren are a widely Protestant group, widely in Bohemia, Poland, that area today. Next slide. This is a statue of Hus in the town square of Prague. Something you see if you visit Prague. It's a lovely city. I recommend it. Next slide. Martin Luther. We get to Germany. The person you think is the reformer of all reformers. We've now heard of Hus and a lot of things that have happened. Now we get to Luther and what's going on in Germany. Luther is born in 1483. He lives until 1546. The next two reformers are not killed. They simply die of natural causes, so that's good to know. Next slide. Again, Luther is the middle arrow, Wittenberg, in central eastern Germany. Next slide. Oh, we went one too far. One back if we could. Yeah, there we go. He's in the protectorate or principality of the Elector Fredrick the Wise. At the time, there's a Holy Roman Emperor. There are 7 electors who elect the Holy Roman Emperor. Usually one of the electors is elected Holy Roman Emperor, which covers a wide swath of Germany, Spain, all places in between. Fredrick the Elector, as well as being the ruler of the area, He is known as one of the, if not the, greatest collector of relics in the world. So Fredrick has a great collection of saints' relics that he purchases and has in his area. Luther's to study law, but famously he gets caught in a storm and kicked from a horse, and he prays to St. Anne, saying, I'll become a monk if you save me from this storm. He's saved from the storm, and he goes to become a monk. His dad's not really happy with him, but there he is. He becomes a monk. He studies theology, becomes an Augustinian monk, and he becomes deeply concerned in the righteousness or justification of the believer, as we talked about in the sermon today, and how it can be reconciled. So Luther wants to love the Lord his God with all his heart, mind, and soul. He wants to do it, but he's trying to figure out, he doesn't want to leave any sin uncovered, is kind of what happens. And as I said in the sermon, he goes to confession multiple times a day, and his confessors finally say, Martin, go do something worth confessing. You're wearing us out. The sins you're confessing aren't really sins. Because he studies and confesses. That's like his daily ritual, it seems like. Go ahead, Paul, next. So he becomes focused on the righteousness of God, and as I said in the sermon, he has a revelation that the righteousness of God does not mean a standard of righteousness we need to attain, but it's God's righteousness that is given to us. We are justified by God's grace. So he reads that part in Romans chapter 3, which we read in service this morning, and he has a revelation about it, that we're justified by faith in God, we don't have to attain the righteousness of God through faith. Big, huge kind of moment in Luther's thing. And I will say, because I think it's probably true, that Luther was known to have gastrointestinal issues throughout his life, and it's said that his revelation came when he was settling some of those issues. So his best thinking was done where it often is. So I say that not just to laugh, but it's kind of a pretty common story that happened. Next one. So sin, purgatory, and indulgences. We need to understand this to understand what indulgences were and why they were offensive to some. Okay? At the time, there's a complex understanding of forgiveness, sin, forgiveness, and absolution. The imparting of forgiveness, that's absolution by the church. So sin, there's two parts to sin. There's an eternal penalty and a temporal penalty. So there's a penalty in heaven and on earth. So when you go to be forgiven, the priest, your confessor, can forgive you for the eternal penalty. You no longer have the eternal penalty weighing on you. But you have to work off the temporal penalty. And that comes in acts of penance. And some of the things you can do for acts of penance are to go on a pilgrimage to a famous site. That will help you work that off. So if you did something that says, like, maybe there's 10 years of penance that you have to do, you can get 5 years credit for a pilgrimage. You can get a few years credit for this or a few years credit for that. I'm not saying that's how Catholicism works today. I'm saying that this is what it was. So you're forgiven eternally, but temporally you still have to work your sins out through penance. The thing is, most people die before they can work their sins out. So what happens is you end up in a place called purgatory, which is where you have to be until your sins get done out. Now, the thing is, anybody can pay the penalty. It doesn't have to be the person who sinned. So if a priest says Mass for you, that knocks off some of your time in purgatory and so forth until you can go to God in heaven. Crusades were a famous way to get crusaders to come. The Pope would offer plenary indulgences, which is forgiveness of sins past, present, and yet to come. If you go on a crusade, you get that. One of the crusades that the Pope launches is in 1620 against the Hussites. So people wiped out the Hussites. The Catholic Church wiped out the Hussites. I don't want to say Catholic. It's just the church, really, at the time. But by offering this crusade, and that's why crusaders are motivated, because that means they don't have to do all the penance. They could just go on the crusade, right? So the thing is that there's this treasury of merits that you can tap into. So the Pope has control over the treasury of merits, and that is all the good works of saints that have come before. So the Pope can open up this treasury of merits, and that's how the Pope can offer these indulgences. Because the Pope can say, I have the power to do this because I can this bank of merit that I have can apply to your sin. And that's how we move you through purgatory. Okay? So that's a key understanding. we don't have to agree with it, but we have to know that's what it was in that day. That's what happened to you. You could be forgiven eternally, but you still had to work out your forgiveness here on earth, the temporal. And that's why indulgences were such a big thing, because they could shorten your stay in purgatory. This is a big deal at the time. Next slide.
And this is what's coming out of the Pope and the Catholic Church in Rome.
This is what's coming out of the church.
The church.
There's no Catholic Church. It's just the church. There's a Greek Orthodox split, but they're still, they're all in the same. The Pope is in Rome and one Pope, yeah.
And all is well with the world.
Was there another question?
Yeah, I wonder about the Orthodox Church. They believe the exact same thing.
What's that?
The Orthodox Church.
The Greek Orthodox Church, well, it's not just Greek. There's a lot of Orthodox movements. I believe, Richard, that they had the same concept of forgiveness. I don't know of the offering of indulgences in the Greek or in the Orthodox tradition as much as the Catholic tradition. So in 1054, the two traditions kind of split. They excommunicate each other. So there's kind of one head of a church in Constantinople. There's one head of a church in Rome. So we're really talking about the Roman Catholic world, so not the Eastern Church at the time. I can't say for sure that the Orthodox Church has the same understanding by this time, 500 years later. Pope Leo X wants to build a church of all churches. It's called St. Peter's. It's going to be in Rome. Many of us know about it. Some of us have visited there today. He borrows money from Jacob Fugger, who's an Augsburg banker. He has to pay the money back. So what does he do? He goes to his treasury of merits, and he's going to sell indulgences. This is how you can raise money for the church. But Leo doesn't sell the indulgences directly. He allows people to buy the right to sell indulgences. So somebody named Archbishop Albrecht of Mainz pays a good fee to Leo, and now he can sell indulgences in his area, and he leases those indulgences out to the Dominicans in the area, okay? Every time, Johann Tetzel is like the used car salesman of indulgence sellers. He goes over and above, and he's probably corrupt even among indulgence sellers, which is a tough kind of way to be. But he's known to say, and this rhymes in German too, every time the coin in coin box rings, another soul from purgatory springs. And so not only is he saying that you can help your own salvation by not staying in purgatory, Tetzel says, your dear grandmother, what if she's in purgatory? Well, if you pay this fee, she'll be released. What about your children? Who knows what they'll do in sinning? So Tetzel's selling indulgences that cover all kinds of things. They're supposed to apply to the believer, but he's selling past, present, and yet to come, which is overkill. Everything is on sale, as I say. Go ahead. Elector Fredrick's beef, here's his problem. He has a great collection of relics. People pay for pilgrimages to see his relics to work off their penance. But if you could just buy an indulgence, nobody's going to tourism to see Fredrick the Elector's relics anymore. So he forbids the selling of indulgences in his lands because it's killing his pocketbook and his relic collection, which is an income producer. It sounds ridiculous, but this is actually happening. This is what's going on. So he outlaws all Dominicans in his area because they're the ones who have the least to do the indulgences. The logical conclusion from a debate-minded young theologian. Next slide. Luther says, we got some things we need to talk about in the church, and indulgences is one of them. So Luther does what somebody does who's a professor and a priest at the time when he wants to debate topics. He posts these topics for debate, and he puts them in the town square. And when you post topics for debate, it's like saying there's going to be a showdown. And he puts the date that it's going to be. And he's ready to defend any one of these 95 statements, these 95 theses. And anyone who wants to come and debate him, they're welcome to. He'll be here. He named the time and the place. All you have to do is show up. It's said that he nailed these to the door at the church in Wittenberg which is like the library bulletin board. It wouldn't have been uncommon to do that. It's quite possible that he mailed it throughout town. So either way, that's what people in Wittenberg have told me. Either way, he posted them. So it's proper to say he posted them, whether or not he nailed them to the church door or sent them about town. October 31st, 1517, that's the date he did it. 95 Theses. Luther and many other academics had done this before. This is how you have debates. This is like what the town comes out for, is to see the big debate. That's what entertainment is in those days. And if you're in a university and you're a rector, you're supposed to debate people. That's how you talk about topics. It's just that these topics got a little bit more heated. Some of the reasons are when you have a debate like this, you send this to your immediate superior. So Luther sent it to his superior, who was the archbishop who was in charge of indulgences. So it didn't really rub him the right way. Also, there are no Dominicans allowed in the territory of Fredrick the Elector. So there's nobody to debate him. And so Luther's claims aren't even able to be really refuted. So there's some things that go on to start making this really perk up, and there's some problems. Wittenberg post office versus Wittenberg church door. Either way, he posts them. WPO versus WCD. And this debate, which Luther just figured would be a debate, it ends up getting translated into different languages and sent out. The printing press is becoming an instrument these days. This is one of the first big uses of the printing press. Goes far and wide. All of a sudden, what's meant to be a debate and reform some practices in his area becomes huge. One of the first runaway bestsellers as far as printing goes.
But Luther knew nobody was going to show up.
There was nobody to show up. There was no Dominican for this Augustinian.
Even though he posted.
Yeah, but he still did the right things in sending. There wasn't always a debate. A lot of times there was just topics to say, I'm willing to debate this anytime, and it's people, that's interesting. Oh, okay. So 95 different things. This is the Wittenberg town square. That's Luther's picture, and that's me teaching kids about Luther in front of Luther's statue. And that's a blue screen. So what happens next? Well, eventually, Luther is brought into question. So we're talking about 1517. By the time of 1521, the Diet of Worms is held, W-O-R-M-S, pronounced V, not W. It's a place, not an animal. It's not little creepy crawly things. One more. Oh, sorry, the Rumble at Lepzig. So they do have a debate 2 years later. It's at Lepzig. Dr. Martin Luther debates Dr. Johann Eck, and they call each other. Eck calls Luther Lügner, which means Mr. Liar, and Luther calls Dr. Johann Eck Dreck, which is Dr. Eck. Dreck means dirt, but dirt that comes out of you. So they debated each other. They called each other Mr. Liar and Mr. Dirt in the debate. So these are recorded at the time. We know that they were pulling no punches. Eck accuses Luther of being a Hussite. Luther says, I don't know what that is. Eck gives him a bunch of books. He returns the next day and he says, I am a Hussite, it turns out. He proudly claims, yes. And he says, and that's what the Bible says. There's nothing wrong with being a Hussite. And they debate. It's published widely. There's no champion claimed there. They send it to the University of Paris to proclaim a champion. The University of Paris says Luther's wrong and wants to excommunicate him. And Pope Leo X excommunicates Luther in 1520. So now we get to the Diet of Worms. Next slide. Diet of Worms, the electorate, the Holy Roman Empire, the electorate, all 7 places, they switch where they have meetings each year. Worms is the place they're going to have a meeting, and they invite Luther on safe passage to debate. Luther, like Hus before him, is offered this. He comes. They say, Luther, defend yourself, and he says, anything for the Bible, you can counter any of my claims. And they say, defend yourself. He says, I'm asking you to tell me where I'm wrong. And he famously says, not to try and be heroic, but just says, listen, this is how I read the Bible. Here I stand, I can do no other. That's here I stand is kind of a famous Lutheran quote. he's allowed to return to Wittenberg, but on his way back to Wittenberg, he's kidnapped. Except this time, unlike Hus being burned at the stake, Luther's kidnapped by his protector. So they do it to bring him into hiding. So he's cloistered at a castle in Wartburg. You can see the next one there, Paul. He stayed for 2 years, at which time he translated the Bible into German. He standardizes the German language because of this translation. He writes far and wide against his opponents. And he argues Jesus is the head of the church over any pope or doctrine. He argues scriptural authority over church doctrine. He argues justification by faith alone. And he returns home, he marries a nun, and he ends up able to live out his life in Wittenberg under the protection of Fredrick. By that time, whole principalities are becoming Protestant or Lutheran now, so it's not as easy to target one person. Paul? Oh, he was known as Brother George in Wartburg. They said, is Martin Luther living there? No, it's just Brother George, just a monk. This is Luther's home, where he lived with his wife, formerly a monastery in Wittenberg there. We get to John Calvin, and he's a French guy, Jean Calvin. He operates in Switzerland because it's not safe to be in France. Next slide. We're in the leftmost there as you look at it. Next slide. A quick aside. Huldrych Zwingli is an important reformer. He's a Swiss reformer based in Zurich, a contemporary of Luther who's claimed not to be influenced by Luther, just as Luther was claimed not to be influenced by Hus, but they have all the same ideas pretty much. Zwingli and Luther have a famous conference in 1529 to see if the Reformed movement and the Lutheran movement that are getting underway could be one and the same. They agree on 14 points of doctrine, including Jesus as the only head, Scripture over any church doctrine, justification by faith. They could not agree on what happens at communion. Zwingli says that Jesus is in heaven. You cannot bring him down to the table. Therefore, the bread and the wine stay bread and wine. And spiritually, we are transformed. Luther says, no, their transubstantiation happens where they are bread and wine, but they are also the body and blood of Christ. Either one is different than the Catholic view that transubstantiation is the Catholic view that they become only the body and blood of Christ. That's why to this day you will see a priest finish the cup because you cannot leave any of it behind. Lutherans view not trans but cons, where they are bread and wine, but they become the body and blood of Christ, and then they revert back to blood and wine, or wine and bread. So Lutherans believe that there's kind of a mix there. Zwingli said they are never the body and blood of Jesus. Jesus is in heaven. We cannot bring him down to earth. Okay, so that's an important change because the Reformed movement and the Lutheran movement may have merged at the beginning, which, by the way, in Germany, they have merged now. Today, they are one and the same. Reformed and Lutheran are the same evangelical church, they call it today. So Lutheranism becomes isolated because they have this one view, and unless you believe that, then you're kind of not Lutheran. Whereas the Reformed movement now starts to ebb and flow in different kind of perspectives. And it starts to spread to different principalities and towns and cities. Interestingly, Lutheranism has a system of bishops, much like the Catholic faith. It's more popular in the country, where there's authority over others. Calvinism, which we'll get to, or Reformed tradition, starts becoming more popular in cities because they are run by usual local governments, boards. And the Reformed movement, instead of being run by bishops, is run by councils. So it becomes more of an urban movement, where Lutheranism becomes more of a rural movement, much because of its governance. Zwingli dies in October 1531 in war with Catholic Swiss. He dies in the battlefield. So he's an interesting guy because he's kind of a predecessor of Calvin. Calvin grows up in France. His father connects him with the bishop. When he graduates from grammar school, he is appointed priest of the town, which means that any offerings collected, Calvin's entitled to oversee them, but after grammar school. So this is the way that when this happens, it's basically a scholarship, so that the church expenses are covered. The rest goes to Calvin, so he could be educated in seminary and Catholic schools. This is not uncommon. It seems ridiculous today. So basically, the person who's given the benefices they pay for a local priest. So Calvin was not the priest of the church. He paid for an actual priest to do it, but then the extra money became kind of a scholarship for schooling. That's how he attends school, because he doesn't come from a very wealthy family. He studies law, but after his father dies, he switches to humanist studies, which is religion and classics based on reforming society in the church. And based on early publishings in 1532, Calvin's Catholic, as he was raised. But he resigns his benefices in 1534. He says, I'm not going to take that from the church anymore. Richard.
The Catholic bishop that you,
I'm sorry?
his father was connected with the Catholic bishop?
Yeah, his father's connected with his local Catholic bishop. That's how he gets Calvin an education. Because usually only members of the inner circle of the bishop's inner circle would be educated after grammar school.
But John was like a priest when he's a child?
He's assigned the benefices of his church, which technically means he's a priest, but in practice means the income pays for a priest for the local church and provides him a scholarship for study, which he otherwise wouldn't have been able to do. So the bishop assigns the benefice to a promising young person so that they can be educated, is essentially what happens. So this wasn't uncommon for the day.
He's just a priest in name only.
He's a priest in name only, and even really, I don't know that anybody would have called him a priest, but when you're assigned the benefices, that kind of means you're the priest of the church, but it also means you have to pay for somebody to be the priest if you're not capable of doing that. His friend Nicholas Kopp was named head of the University of Paris. Calvin may have written Kopp's inaugural address. It was seen as too Protestant. Both of them are sought by authorities and they flee. Calvin travels, introduced to French and Swiss reformers. He settles in Basel, where he writes the first edition of the Institutes of Christian Religion in 1535. We're coming up on time, so I'm going to go through a little bit of Calvinism. I wanted to give you the idea of the other reformers, but Calvin's largely self-taught as a theologian. He does not end up going to theology school, okay? So he doesn't go to school for theology. He writes the Institutes of Christian Religion is his most famous work. It starts with like a 200-page draft. It's now over 1,500 pages by the end of his career. Next slide. Geneva is Catholic at the time, but the townspeople begin arguing with their clergy over the Bible. As they were literate and had access to new printings, they started saying, we don't think this is right. A small council of city leaders kicked out all the religious leaders connected with France. All the Catholics, they kicked them out of town. At least 10% of the population. They allied with Basel and sent for new teachers. So this is Geneva. Reformed Protestants took their place. Calvin arrives, and he wants to study there, but he's persuaded to teach. But there's a falling out with town authorities 2 years later, so he leaves. Next slide. He goes to study with his friend Martin Bucer. 3 years later, Catholic influence is rising, and the leaders of the town don't want to see Catholicism take back over, so they invite Calvin back because they know he's a good preacher and teacher. He demands a large house, good salary, and 500 liters of wine a year if you're going to get me to come back. They say, okay. He's like, oh, all right, you met my demands. I got to come back. So he comes back. He begins to teach and preach, and he's also the town lawyer because he's the one who's most educated in law. So he advises the town council on the law, and he runs the church, but he really does advocate for a separation of the two. However, there's an overlap between the two, and they call that group of town people and church people the consistory. And that's where they settle moral issues in town. We have a consistory today. Our council is called a consistory today still. He becomes the most influential reformer of the day because Geneva becomes a refuge for people all over the place who have Reformed or Protestant beliefs. And Calvin's the first to publish widely in French, which unlike Czech and German, were local languages, French is an imperial language. So Calvin's ideas spread really rapidly about things. The Genevans, French outnumber Genevans eventually. The French come in, and Genevans are like, there's too many immigrants here. We have too many French people. And the Genevans rebel, but they are told, we're supposed to be a welcoming place. So some Genevans flee, some native Genevans, and some are even executed. Calvin stays on the sidelines there. He doesn't get involved in it, but it happens under his watch. He believes in 4 offices: elder, deacon, preacher. That's the other is doctor. That's teacher. That's the 4th office of the church. In the Reformed Church today, we have elder, deacon, minister of word and sacrament, and professor of theology. We hold Calvin's 4 offices. Refugees and doctors. Geneva was a great place for people coming, and they educated you there. And then educated people went back to where they were from and spread Calvinism very far. Consistory overlaps. Main ideas. Predestination. Calvin gets his belief from Augustine and Paul, that the idea that before we are created, God chooses us for salvation. He has a high ecclesiology versus someone like Menno Simmons. Menno Simmons, a Mennonite who's an Anabaptist, his followers believe that if the church is not pure, you as a Christian must leave it. If you're a part of a church that not everybody has correct theology, you have to leave it, otherwise you will be corrupted. Calvin says, no, the church is made up of people who are saved and those who aren't. And so you have to be part of the church body. You do not separate for purity's sake. So it's a big difference between Anabaptists, who also say that once you are in a pure church, you are baptized again. So you can get baptized more than once. Calvin says no. Calvin has a tougher view, not a tougher view, but a tighter view on being a part of the church, even when there's some in error. You work to correct that. That's what discipline is about in the church. You don't leave. Communion, he's middle ground between Zwingli, who believes that spiritually the bread and wine are transformed, and Luther, who believes in transubstantiation. Calvin says, yes, it is true that Jesus is in heaven, but yes, it is also true that we commune with Jesus at communion. So how does that happen? Calvin says, mysteriously, we are brought to heaven when we commune with Jesus. So Jesus doesn't come to us, we go up to Jesus. That's Calvin's contribution to all of this. 1550s, Dutch in the Low Countries, that's Belgium, Luxembourg. They're becoming more Calvinist. Philip II, King of Spain. These countries are part of his possession when he takes the crown. He goes to stamp out Protestantism. He's a Spaniard, Catholic. And he starts the Inquisition, kill at minimum 8,000 people for not being Catholic. The Netherlands rebels and slowly gathers steam with Catholics and Protestants joining against Philip II. So we think of the Netherlands, our spiritual heritage, as a reformed place. It was, but it was also Catholic. But what they didn't like was the king coming in and telling them what to do. So even Catholics converted to Protestantism because it became a nationalistic religion, not just theological thing. Again, we have the urban councils and the rural lords, the difference between kind of a Lutheran understanding and Reformed. The Reformed came around councils. Lutheran still was a hierarchy of lords. And the Netherlands becomes independent from Spain. This is a famous ship. Henry Hudson sailed on it. Does anybody know the name of Henry Hudson's ship? Phyllis. The Half Moon. Phyllis has a great understanding of the Reformation. I know that not just because she got that answer. Henry Hudson sails up the Hudson, named after Henry Hudson, on this ship. He's English. He sails for the Dutch. That's why if you go up the Hudson a little ways, you get to Half Moon, New York. We have roots in Hudson's exploration, the RCA. We came to New York City in 1628. We founded the first RCA church, St. Nicholas Reformed Church. We still have connection to the Netherlands. There's religious and financial motivations for mostly the Dutch are traders who come at this time. And they bring their religion with them. But they didn't come because of religious persecution. They came from a place where they were the majority. And they come for trading and that kind of thing. They continue up the Hudson River into what we call Albany today. They founded Fort Orange in 1642. St. Nicholas Reformed Church is today the wow, I just missed that one. The Collegiate Reformed Church. One church meets in 5 different places. New York City, it has been uninterrupted in ministry since 1628. The first church in Albany, founded in 1642, is still called the First Church in Albany. It is a Reformed church. It was the original Fort Orange church. It is now a church there, a Reformed church. In New York, the English took over New York without a war in 1664, but the king granted the Reformed church a charter to continue to operate. So the Reformed church has its own charter. So it is independent of the English kind of transition. They still got their training for ministry up until about the Revolutionary War, and then we switched to having training locally so that you didn't have to send, oh, you're a promising candidate to be a minister. We'll send you to the Netherlands, study there for 2 years, and then come back. And then we'll see you then. Like, we called our pastor in 3 short years on the frontier. They'll be with us. Like, no. So they wanted to train them locally. They founded a university that's now known as Rutgers University. That was a seminary and became the Dutch Reformed university until it became a state university years later. Local growth until the 1800s with Dutch immigration. 1800s, there was a Midwestern immigration. But the thing was, the Dutch Reformed Church kept speaking Dutch until finally in the 1880s, they finally converted to English. So you can imagine there was expansion, but only among a certain group of people. Because if you're only speaking Dutch, that's why the Methodists, the Presbyterians, they do much better at early expansion because they speak English. It's a common language people learn. Whereas Dutch, if you're not Dutch, you're not going to learn Dutch when you move to the U.S. At the time, colonies, and then later that. Immigration in the mid-1800s in the Midwest to California with dairy farmers afterwards, to the Southwest when people retire in Arizona, Florida, Canada after World War II. These are pockets of Dutch immigration where the RCA tends to grow. We founded some churches as well in other geographic regions, but we tend to be geographically where Dutch people immigrated over the years. Local congregation, we're headed by the consistory. The regional is the classis, which is made up of the elders and ministers under its jurisdiction. We have a regional jurisdiction of the regional synod, we call it. That's all of upstate New York. Classis of regional synod of Albany is actually all of upstate New York. And then we have an international general synod, which is all the Reformed churches in Canada and the U.S., soon to include Central America too. We're planting churches down there as well. We continue to be mission-minded in the RCA over the years. RCA missions have been marked by tent building, which means, tent making, I should say, which means we go and send people there not just to be a missionary, but also with a job. So usually we do missions of healthcare, education, farming, those kind of things. We founded the medical system in India. We founded in Oman. The Sultan allows the Reformed Church to run the Protestant church in Oman because we were there before oil. So there are connections that go back centuries. The Reformed Church, New Brunswick Seminary on Rutgers campus sent the first missionaries to Korea, which now is one of the most Presbyterian places. But we founded a denomination in Mexico, in Chiapas, which is larger numerically than our own. The Reformed Church goes to mission, and as it works, they leave it to the people there. So we don't stamp the name there. That's why you don't see the Reformed Church in America in India, where there used to be a big Reformed church. It's now part of the Church of South India. We kind of let the people there take it over. That's the way we've done mission for many years. So usually we pair something, a need we see, with the evangelism as well. Statements I mentioned too: Heidelberg Catechism, Belgic Confession, Canons of the Synod of Dort. And then we have the Athanasian Creed, Apostles' Creed, Nicene Creed. A number of these are here. Here you can take a look at them if you'd like a copy. I'd be glad to provide you with one. They are also found on the internet. Okay, sorry I had to breeze through a little bit. We went 10 minutes over. Does anybody have any quick questions? You're dismissed, but if anybody has a question, feel free to stick around. Thank you all for coming. I hope that you learned something today. We are recording it. It'll be online. It'll be on YouTube, Pete. So if you want to look over this again, you can see it on YouTube. Probably, Lois, you can play it a little slower, yeah. Yes.